The Atlantic hurricane season. It officially begins on June 1st and ends on November 30th. Now, these are conventional dates and are by no means a hard and fast rule. Nature does what nature wants, and we are powerless to stop it. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, now in its second year from the Weather Network in Canada. The 1998 Atlantic hurricane season is considered one of the most disastrous Atlantic hurricane seasons on record. This day in weather history. We talk a lot here on this podcast about the worst storm season ever. But there can only be one though, right? Not always is it as easy as that. When it happens to you, it becomes your worst ever, and then you know it as the worst ever. We also talk often about patterns that signal either a high or low Atlantic hurricane season, and they are known by the names La Niña and El Niño. La Niña is a feeding of above-average sea surface temperatures with a pattern of much warmer air traveling along the equator. Warm waters equals better feeding for hurricane potential. And this season had above-average activity due to the moving away of the El Niño event and the rise of the La Niña conditions. In 1998, the first tropical cyclone of the season, Tropical Storm Alex, developed on July 27th. And the season's finale was with Hurricane Nicole when it became extratropical on December 1st. So it was a later start, but it ended on time almost to the day. Welcome to year 2 of this podcast. Right now, you're listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider, but there's also the daily podcast video short. They're shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective, but oftentimes they will include visuals from that day's event from when it happened in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. Of the storms that developed in this historic 1998, several made landfall or directly affected land. Hurricane Bonnie made landfall in southeastern North Carolina as a Category 2 hurricane in late August. That one killed 5 people and caused about $1 billion in damage. Hurricane Earl caused $79 million in damage and caused 3 deaths after making landfall in Florida as a Category 1 hurricane. But that year, that 1998 Atlantic hurricane season featured 2 that stood alone as headline-grabbing for their sheer devastation and devastating death toll. And both were wearing and tearing as I was out at sea a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away where my great adventure took place. That's all I'm saying. Hurricane George was a major Category 3 storm that held its strength and status long enough to devastate Saint Kitts and Nevis, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic. Now that is a ton of the Caribbean to be taken out by one event, including Puerto Rico, where, for the back half of the 1990s, I figuratively called home. George peaked as an intense Category 4 hurricane, tore through the aforementioned island nations as a raucous Cat 3, before then again making another landfall, this time near Biloxi, Mississippi, causing horrendous and significant damage. It was here in Biloxi where George also took the lives of at least 600 who were confirmed killed by this storm. Then there was Mitch. Mitch was a very powerful and destructive late-season Cat 5 hurricane that made landfall in Florida as a tropical storm after battering much of Central America. Mitch would be noted as being the strongest storm of the season and, as I mentioned off the top, stood alone on that mantle as the 8th most intense Atlantic hurricane ever recorded until Hurricane Dean in 2007. Mitch, through its duration, produced across Central America significant damage and there killed at least 11,000 people, making this system the second deadliest hurricane in recorded history behind only the Great Hurricane of 1780. So George holds on to 8th spot for 9 years, while Mitch closes in on a hurricane legend that was almost 220 years old. And those were just 2 of the 4 hurricanes spinning at the same time in the Atlantic this day in weather history. Hey, do you like the podcast? We'd love to hear from you. If you have an idea, go right now to wherever you're listening to me and rate us if you would, please. It's on a 5-star system, and we would love as many stars as you can afford. So rate us, but then also review us. This way we can always stay on top of how you'd like to see the show evolve. Then remember to subscribe to this podcast. Click the subscribe or follow button right there on the very same podcast homepage you're listening on. You'll be immediately reminded that the next day is ready to listen to, and you also have access to every episode in the archives. It dates back to June 1st of 2020, so there is a lot that we got to get caught up on this day in weather history. Tomorrow is September 26th, and we're staying tropical with the story of Typhoon Vera. We're going to call it Vera, because it was also known locally as the Isiwan typhoon that struck Japan in 1959. So tomorrow, we're going to go back in time on this day in weather history with me, your host, Chris May.